Joseph. The story. Joseph is Jacob's 11th son and Rachel's first. He has one younger brother through Rachel, Benjamin, and 12 older half-brothers through his father Jacob's other 3 wives, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. Their names are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, and Zebulun. He also has one half-sister, Dinah, born to his stepmother Leah. Joseph is the father of 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and the husband of Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. His grandparents are Isaac and Rebekah, and his great-grandparents are Abraham and Sarah. Jacob loved Joseph more than all his brothers, showing this by gifting him a coat of many colours. Joseph's brothers knew their father loved him most and resented him. The strained relation between Joseph and his brothers wasn't helped when he had 2 dreams. In Joseph's first dream, he and his 11 brothers were represented by sheaves of grain. Joseph's sheaves stood above theirs, with their sheaves bowing to him. Joseph's second dream was the same, yet the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing before him instead of sheaves of grain. Joseph recalled both these dreams to his brothers, and the second also to his father Jacob. All rejected his stories as nonsense, yet Jacob pondered them, while Joseph's brothers became even more jealous and bitter towards him. At some point following this, Jacob asked Joseph to travel to Shechem and help his brothers with the flocks. However, when he arrived, Joseph discovered they had moved to Dothan. In Dothan, Joseph's brothers saw Joseph approaching over the horizon. Disgruntled, they decided to kill him and throw his body into one of the nearby pits and claim he was attacked by a wild animal when Jacob questioned them. Yet the oldest Reuben stepped in, suggesting they shouldn't kill Joseph. He agreed they should throw him into the pit. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ambushed him, stripped him bare, and dumped him into an empty nearby pit. Afterward they sat down to eat, and spotted coming from the direction of Gilead a caravan of Ishmaelite spice traders headed for Egypt. Joseph's brother Judah suggested they sell Joseph to these Ishmaelite traders. His brothers agreed, and they sold Joseph to them for 20 shekels coins of silver, with about $200 today. Joseph journeyed with these traders to Egypt, where he was sold to Pharaoh's officer, Potiphar. Back in Dothan, Reuben returned and checked the pit. He confronted his younger brothers. As Joseph was gone, they explained what they did, and to cover their tracks, they tore Joseph's colourful coat and sprinkled it with the blood of a male goat they killed. They brought their creation to Jacob, who wept bitterly on seeing it, concluding that Joseph must have been killed by a wild animal, not knowing he was in Egypt. Although Joseph's future seemed bleak, God was with him, leading him to work in Potiphar's house, and caused everything Joseph touched to prosper exceedingly. As a result, Joseph was named Potiphar's personal servant and overseer, giving him authority over all Potiphar's possessions. Unfortunately, Joseph's downfall would come when Potiphar's wife took a liking to him, as he was handsome in appearance and build. She repeatedly pressured Joseph into having an affair with her, despite him denying her request each time. Joseph was alone in Potiphar's house working on his tasks one day, when Potiphar's wife approached him, again trying to seek a relationship with him. However, this time she grabbed Joseph by the garment. Without thinking, Joseph fled, leaving his garment behind. Potiphar's wife brought the garment to the other servants and later her husband Potiphar, telling both that Joseph tried to force himself on her and fled the scene when she screamed for help. After hearing the words of his wife, Potiphar was furious with Joseph. He arrested him and sent him to prison. Like before, God was with Joseph and caused everything he touched to prosper. He found favour with the chief jailer, who put him completely unsupervised in charge of all the other inmates. 2 of these prisoners were Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, imprisoned because they offended the king. One night, both the cupbearer and baker had separate dreams they couldn't interpret. The next morning, Joseph offered to try and interpret their dreams, since no one else could. The cupbearer recalled his first. In his dream, he saw a vine with 3 branches that had started to blossom and produce grapes. The cupbearer picked some of the grapes, squeezed their juice into Pharaoh's cup, and gave said cup to his master. Joseph understood this dream to mean that in 3 days Pharaoh would release the cupbearer and return him to his original duties. Joseph also asked the cupbearer to put in a good word about him with Pharaoh because of this favour, hoping it would get him released. 3 days later, Joseph was right. It was Pharaoh's birthday, and he held a feast for all his servants. He released the cupbearer and restored him to his original position. However, the cupbearer never mentioned Joseph. Joseph also interpreted the baker's dream. His dream was this. The baker saw himself carrying 3 white baskets on his head, with the top one filled with all kinds of baked goods. Unfortunately, some birds were eating the contents of the top basket. Joseph understood this to mean that the baker would be released 3 days later, like the cupbearer. However, he wouldn't return to his duties. Instead, he would be hung from a tree, and the birds would feast on him. Again, Joseph was right. The baker was released on Pharaoh's birthday with the cupbearer, yet like Joseph deciphered, was hung from a tree. 2 full years later, Pharaoh had 2 separate dreams. The first consisted of 14 cows, 7 healthy and fat, eating grass by the Nile River, and 7 skinny and weak cows who swallowed the healthy ones without gaining any weight. His second dream was the same, but with corn instead of cows, 7 healthy and 7 unhealthy. Again, the unhealthy ones swallowed the healthy ones, showing no change. Like the cupbearer and baker, Pharaoh couldn't interpret what he had seen. Even after consulting with everyone in Egypt he thought could help. The cupbearer then remembered Joseph, recalling to Pharaoh what he had done. Pharaoh ordered Joseph be brought to him. Joseph, clean and presentable, explained Pharaoh's dreams, prophesied 7 years of prosperity coming to Egypt, with 7 years of extreme famine following this. Because of this, Joseph proposed that Pharaoh should appoint someone to oversee the preparations, suggesting that around 20% of each crop should be stored. Pharaoh and his servants agreed. Like many times before, God was with Joseph. Pharaoh appointed him as the overseer he proposed, giving him the title Zaphenath-paneah, most likely Egyptian for God speaks or he lives. Pharaoh also gave Joseph his signet ring, clothes of linen, and a gold necklace, plus let him ride in Pharaoh's second chariot, and gave him Potiphar, priest of On's daughter, Asenath, as a wife, the mother of his children Manasseh and Ephraim. The 7 years of prosperity came and went, and the food supply was abundant throughout the whole of Egypt. Then the years of famine began, spreading not just in Egypt, but to the 4 corners of the globe. Egypt was the only place to find food, so the people of the earth travelled there in their thousands. This included Joseph's brothers and his father Jacob. All Joseph's brothers, excluding Benjamin, travelled to Egypt at their father's request. Joseph recognized his brothers among the crowds. He remembered the dreams he had concerning his brothers, so disguised himself and spoke harshly to them, accusing them of being spies. The 10 brothers didn't recognize Joseph and denied these charges, claiming they were 12 brothers, 10 here, 1 at home and 1 dead, and only interested in purchasing supplies. Any attempt to clear their names were unsuccessful, with the disguised Joseph sentencing them to 3 days in prison. Joseph released his brothers 3 days later, but with a condition. He required that 1 remain in custody while the rest returned with the supplies they came for, and they returned to him with their youngest brother, proving the story claimed. Before deciding which one, Joseph left to compose himself and returned, selecting Simeon and sending the others on their way with the items purchased. The 9 brothers arrived home in Canaan, informing their father what happened in Egypt. They then emptied their sacks, and each had the bundle of money each paid for the goods, to everyone's surprise and distress, not knowing Joseph had ordered these be packed with their order back in Egypt. Jacob refused to let them return with Benjamin, not wanting to lose another son. Reuben bargained his 2 sons if anything happened on their trip, but Jacob wasn't hearing any of it. When the stock ran dry, Jacob commanded his 9 brothers to return to Egypt for more, but they refused, not without Benjamin. Again, Jacob wouldn't comply. However, Judah softened Jacob's heart when he vowed to take full responsibility if any harm came to his youngest. Only then did Jacob agree. Before the 10 left, Jacob commanded them to bring the man in charge, him too not aware it was Joseph, a gift of a little balm and a little honey, aromatic gum and myrrh. pistachio nuts and almonds, plus double the money, not to purchase double the supplies, and return the money found in their sacks. When Joseph saw the tent, including Benjamin, ordered his steward to prepare a feast for him and them at his house. As the 10 brothers entered the house, they were afraid, believing this was connected to the money found in their sacks. Yet they were put more at ease when the man told them this was fine, more so when Simeon was presented to them, and yet again when they were treated as guests, not criminals. Joseph returned to his guests around noon. They presented him with the gifts from Jacob and bowed before him. Joseph led them to the dining hall, but ran to his chamber to weep before the feast could begin. He composed himself and returned. They all ate and drank and were merry, and Joseph gave Benjamin 5 times as much as anyone else. After they finished, the 10 returned to Canaan with as much as they could carry, but Joseph slipped his special cup and the money Benjamin paid into his sack. Not long after they departed, Joseph sent some men to confront his brothers about the items in Benjamin's sack. Joseph's men caught the caravan of brothers, accusing them of theft. The brothers vehemently denied this, yet after searching their belongings found the items in question. All returned to Egypt, and Judah spoke in his brother's defense, offering to take his place if any consequences arose. At this point, Joseph couldn't continue the facade. He demanded everyone leave apart from his brothers. Alone with his brothers, he revealed his true identity and wept loud enough that the whole land of Egypt heard it. The 12 brothers kissed, hugged, cried, and talked as a family. The news of Joseph's brothers reached Pharaoh and his servants. In response, Pharaoh gave them wagons full of Egypt's best and change of garments. Benjamin received 5 changes of garments and 300 pieces of silver. Joseph's brothers returned to Canaan and revealed the good news to Jacob. He didn't believe them, but after some persuasion followed them back. The whole family returned to Egypt, including any children and grandchildren. They met Pharaoh and Jacob blessed them. The family settled in Goshen on Joseph's request. Joseph lived the rest of his days in Egypt, dying at age 110. The rest of his family and their descendants would also remain in Egypt for a total of around 430 years, until God raised up a man named Moses. Digging deeper. We'll start by investigating the similarities between Joseph and Jesus. Joseph has been considered a typological predecessor to Christ. Typology, theology, looks at events and figures in the Old Testament that allude to Christ. The main comparison is Joseph's social progression in Egypt, going from a slave to Pharaoh's right-hand man. Paul in 2 Corinthians 8:9 explores Jesus going from poor to rich, leaving God the Father and coming here to earth, staying here for a while and then returning to God's right hand. Another comparison is that both were betrayed for money, 20 shekels for Joseph and Jesus for 30 shekels. Joseph by his brother Judah and Jesus by his friend Judas. Also, the names Judah and Judas are the same name. Judah is the Hebrew translation and Judas is the Greek translation. Another interesting connection. The last connection is when Joseph was the second in command. He became the Saviour to all the people of the earth that called on him for help. This sounds exactly like Jesus, after rising from the dead and returning to the Father's right hand, becomes the Saviour to all the people of the earth that call on him. The difference being Joseph could only provide food, while Jesus provides everlasting life. We'll continue by looking at the story of Jacob blessing Joseph's sons Manasseh and Ephraim. When Jacob was very old, Joseph brought the 2 to him, Ephraim to Jacob's left and Manasseh to Jacob's right. Jacob crossed his arms and placed his hands on the 2's heads, his right on Ephraim and left on Manasseh. While he blessed them, Joseph saw his father's hand placement and demanded he change it by moving his right hand to Manasseh's head. The right hand was usually placed on the one receiving the largest blessing, as what he saw displeased him. Still, he thought Jacob made a mistake because of his age. Yet Jacob knew, saying the older one would serve the younger. This story shares a couple of similarities with the stories of Jacob and Esau from Genesis 27. The first, those giving the blessing, Isaac in Genesis 27, and Jacob in this story, are described as old with dim eyes, making it hard to see. The second is the oldest serving the younger, Jacob over Esau, Ephraim over Manasseh, an idea also explored in the story of Cain and Abel, with God favouring the younger Abel's sacrifice over the older Cain. It is explored in the story of David becoming king, with God choosing the youngest out of 7 brothers. Again, Rachel and Leah, Jacob favouring the younger sister Rachel more than the older Leah. And finally, Joseph, with Jacob gifting him a special coat, showing he loved him more than his 10 older brothers. All these examples show a common theme, not just that they are the younger or youngest sibling, but that they all had the heart after God. What to learn? What should we take away from the story of Joseph? I believe it teaches us the importance and beauty of trusting and staying faithful to God in all circumstances. Joseph was tested by God many times in his story. The first when his brothers sold him as a slave to the Ishmaelite traders. The second when Potiphar's wife accused him of attacking her. The third when Joseph spent 2 full years in prison. Each time God turned it in Joseph's favour. After being sold to Potiphar, God turned things so Joseph would become Potiphar's head servant. After being accused and convicted of the false claims made by Potiphar's wife, God turned things so Joseph would become the prison supervisor. After being released from prison, God turned things so Joseph would become Pharaoh's right-hand man. Why did God do all this for Joseph? Because of his faith and trust, especially evident in the conflict between himself and Potiphar's wife, when Joseph denied her advances, seeing it as wrong and deeply offensive towards God, showing his heart was truly after God. How does this apply to us today? Like Joseph, sometimes things can look bleak, with change and redemption seemingly out of sight, yet God has a way of turning the most tragic and complicated situations for our benefit and salvation. So make sure under all circumstances to stay faithful to God by following his commands and trust in his timing, because at his perfect time he will break your chains and set you free from all your troubles and fears.